I see people flood in, and we'll have them continue to flood in. Thank you so much for being here with us today. We are glad that you could join. My name is Laura. I'm one of the law practice advisors for LCL Mass LOMAP. If you haven't used our services before, we are free and confidential, and we serve legal professionals across Massachusetts, so certainly reach out afterwards. This is one of the many services that we do for lawyers in the state. We have these webinars for busy lawyers every month, which give practical tips on topics of interest to people. So for this month, we are so delighted. Our topic is secondary trauma in the legal profession, something we've been hearing a lot from our consultation clients. People are struggling with lately. And we are absolutely delighted to have Anne Haag be our guest expert speaker today. Anne is a friend of mine. She also is a practice management advisor at the Chicago Bar Association. Anne worked as a patent paralegal at a Chicago IP firm before arriving at the Chicago Bar Association, where she's worked as law practice management and technologies department trainer coordinator for the last 5 years. In addition, Anne has experience as a certified crisis counselor and volunteers as a patient advocate in the ER. So she's very familiar with this. I know that a lot of people may have questions. We're going to have the presentation first. I encourage you to write your questions in your chat, and then we'll moderate and have Q&A at the end. With that, I will turn it over to Anne to start our presentation. Anne, thank you so much for being here, and audience, thank you so much for being here with us too. We are delighted to have you all.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Laura. I'm really happy to be here today. I have a lot of content that I want to get through, so I am just going to go ahead and dive in. If you have any questions, I think we're going to save time at the end for Q&A, but you can also ask throughout, and if I notice it, I can maybe address it as we go. I should also mention, this was not in the bio that I sent Laura, but I am currently in school right now, grad school, to get my social work master's. And so that's another that can, I don't usually include that in a lot of the programs that I teach, which is why it's not in my bio, because it's not always relevant, but I do think it is relevant to this program today. So I should mention that. So let's jump into it here. Before we do anything else, before we talk about secondary trauma, I think we first have to have an understanding of the science of trauma itself. So this is going to be a little science heavy. I'm not a science person. I hope that I'm putting it in language that we can all understand. But trauma is defined by the American Psychological Association as an emotional response to a terrible event like an accident, rape, or natural disaster. Trauma is characterized by both short and long-term effects. Typically, we use trauma to refer to the event that causes the emotional response. The psychological definition, however, has more to do with the emotional response itself. This response is characterized by both short and long-term manifestations. The short term is what the most common reactions that we think of to trauma are fight or flight. Those are the ones that are like, we're the most aware of those, but there are actually two others. There's also fawn and freeze, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. But so these are just more acutely volatile emotions. So like in my work as an ER advocate, you might be in the emergency room with a patient who is, in the thick of a traumatic response and might be cracking jokes. So the things that we see related to trauma are not always what we expect to see. More on that later, but some long-term effects or long-term manifestations related to trauma include unpredictable emotions, flashbacks, strained relationships, physical symptoms like headaches or nausea, etc. So I want to talk about what happens in the brain during a traumatic event, because I think this really increases our understanding of those reactions that we see. During a traumatic event, the amygdala releases some combination of 4 hormones. The amygdala is an almond-shaped mass of gray matter inside each cerebral hemisphere involved with the experiencing of emotions. So during this traumatic event, it releases some combination of 4 hormones, and this can be different based on different people. It can be different based on different, like one person might not always experience the same combination of hormones as they encounter different traumatic events. But so the four hormones that are released are catecholamines. So this is adrenaline, which impairs rational thought, opioids, which prevent pain, and they may also cause a flat affect for up to 96 hours, and may cause the survivor to feel sleepy or numb. Corticosteroids provide energy, so the body's attempt to reduce these can cause a crash in energy. Oxytocin increases positive feelings and may cause the survivor to laugh or giggle while telling a horrible story. So different potential hormone combinations yield different reactions, which may be expressed or controlled, such as, so for example, if you have a response that includes high catecholamine levels plus high cortisol, a victim may fight back or run away. If you have a reaction with high catecholamine but low cortisol, might be a freeze response. So a victim may become temporarily paralyzed and unable to fight or flee, known as tonic immobility. That's what that's referred to as. High oxytocin levels, so a victim might laugh while talking about the trauma. High opioids, a victim may seem eerily calm or sleepy. So the survival hormones released by the amygdala cause cellular damage to the hippocampus, which is the area of the brain that encodes and stores memories. The hormones also flood the neurotransmitter pathways in the brain, creating what we refer to as like a traffic jam that severely impairs the flow of neural signals to the prefrontal cortex, the area that usually produces rational decision making. And this traffic jam can take up to 4 days to clear after a traumatic event. So you're probably, what I would like for you to be thinking about here is if you are thinking about a survivor who goes to an emergency room or something immediately after a traumatic event, and they're probably going to be interviewed by like the police or a detective or, taking some kind of a statement while they're in this headspace. And they might have all these different like hormones flooding through their system, and they have that traffic jam. This leads to, you should be thinking about issues that might pop up here. I want to make a note that kids are particularly vulnerable to trauma because their brains are still developing. This type of developmental trauma can disrupt normal brain development. As a result, especially ongoing trauma can significantly affect a child's long-term emotional development, mental health, physical health, and behavior. And that sense of fear and helplessness may persist into adulthood, and it leaves the person at a significantly higher risk of the effects of future trauma. So there are three types of trauma, broadly speaking. There's acute, chronic, and complex. Acute trauma results from a single stressful or dangerous event. Chronic trauma results from repeated and prolonged exposure to highly stressful events. Examples of this include cases of child abuse, really intense bullying, or domestic violence. Complex trauma results from exposure to multiple traumatic events. So these are all things that if you work in a realm of the law where you're dealing with trauma in your clients, you're probably starting to notice, or this is maybe giving name to some of the things that you're seeing in your clients. Post-traumatic stress disorder develops when the symptoms of trauma persist or get worse in the weeks and months after the stressful event. PTSD is distressing and interferes with a person's daily life and relationships. It's defined by the Mayo Clinic as a mental health condition that's triggered by a terrifying event, either experiencing it or witnessing it. Symptoms may include flashbacks, nightmares, and severe anxiety, as well as uncontrollable thoughts about the event. Another symptom of PTSD is avoidance behavior. So if a person tries to avoid thinking about the traumatic event, or visiting the place where it occurred, or avoiding its triggers, it can be a sign of PTSD also. PTSD can last for years, although treatment can help people to manage their symptoms and improve their quality of life. Risk factors for developing PTSD include previous trauma, physical pain or injury, having little support after the trauma, dealing with other stressors at the same time, such as financial difficulty, previous anxiety or depression, Although most people experience a traumatic event at some point in their lives, not everyone develops PTSD. One estimate puts it around like 6% of the American population suffers from PTSD. So I want to revisit those 4 trauma responses that we talked about before that come about because of different combinations of hormones released by the amygdala during a traumatic event. So again, those are fight, flight, fawn, and freeze. I want to take a look at the immediate reactions because they don't necessarily look how we expect them to look or how we're comfortable with them looking. They challenge our expectations for how victims can behave. And this is important for lawyers to understand because it can help you make sense of more frustrating behaviors exhibited by your clients. So like in the example of an abuse victim trying to leave their abusive spouse, if they exhibit a fawn response, it can be frustrating and confusing to watch. Fawn and freeze are the challenging ones. You know, we're comfortable with the idea of fight or flight. Those don't really give us that's what we want to think that you're going to do in a traumatic event. If you put yourself in someone's, or if you like imagine how you'd like to think that you would react to a trauma, you know, it's to either fight back or to get out of there. In reality, that's not always how we react. And fawn and freeze, they make us uncomfortable because we don't like to think that we would do those things. Fawn tends to develop surrounding childhood trauma typically and becomes a pattern. Children preemptively attempt to appease the abuser by agreeing, answering what they know the parent wants to hear, or by ignoring their personal feelings and desires, doing anything they can basically to prevent the abuse. In terms of more long-term responses to a traumatic event incident, this can look like emotional or physical symptoms or a combination of the two. Freeze, this is uncomfortable also because we don't want to think that we would do that in that situation, but eventually, like essentially you become incapable of moving or making a choice, and you might dissociate or feel paralyzed, that tonic immobility that we talked about before. You know, emotional expressions of trauma responses include denial, anger, fear, sadness, shame, confusion, anxiety, depression, numbness, guilt, hopelessness, irritability, and difficulty concentrating. And then some physical expressions of trauma include headaches, digestive symptoms, fatigue, racing heart, sweating, feeling jumpy, and hyperarousal. So feeling as though you're in a constant state of alertness, which might make sleep difficult, which can compound a lot of other symptoms that might be experienced. So let's get into secondary trauma. Secondary trauma has to do, this is also known as vicarious trauma, secondhand shock. There are a lot of names for it floating around out there, but they all essentially mean the same thing. In order to understand why this happens, we need to first talk about mirror neurons. So these are neurons in your brain, or maybe elsewhere in your body too, I imagine, that fires both when an action is performed and also when you see that action being performed by someone else. So if you are somebody who starts to cry when you see someone else cry, those are mirror neurons doing that. It mirrors the behavior of the other as though the observer were itself acting. So it gets a little confused about who's experiencing the event or the retelling of the event. So if you're around someone who is in that 4-day window of an initial trauma, when their brain is still in traffic jam mode, or when their brain is re-triggered into that mode later on, your brain actually starts mimicking those behaviors that the other person is exhibiting. Your amygdala fires up and starts releasing some combination of those 4 hormones, and you yourself start to feel that trauma as if it were your own, even though it isn't, but your body essentially internalizes it as if it were. So we all have these mirror neurons, and then there's the nature of the profession of the law for both attorneys and their clients. This leads to legal professionals being prime candidates for secondary trauma, basically. So some symptoms of secondary trauma, some physical warning signs include exhaustion, insomnia, headaches, increased susceptibility to illness, sore back and neck, irritable bowel or gastrointestinal distress, rashes, breakouts, grinding your teeth at night, heart palpitations, and hypochondria. Behavioral signs include increased use of alcohol and drugs, anger and irritability at home and or at work, avoidance of clients or patients, watching excessive amounts of TV or Netflix at night, consuming high trauma media as entertainment. This is one that I notice particularly within other victims advocates or other social workers that I know. Yeah, a lot of people who work within the field of like domestic violence that I know, or in sexual violence, they binge watch Law and Order SVU. That's their like comfort show that they watch, which, if you are, I think there's something potentially a little bit more complicated going on there where, I think something that makes shows like that so satisfying is that they tend to have resolutions, and that they tend to, the bad guy gets caught and has to face some kind of consequence for what they did. And in reality, I think because of that, it can be kind of an escapist behavior. So not all of these are like surefire signs of secondary trauma, but if you're experiencing a lot of them, maybe take note. So not returning phone calls at work or at home, avoiding colleagues and staff gatherings, avoiding social events, impaired ability to make decisions, emotional or psychological signs, emotional exhaustion, negative self-image, depression, increased anxiety, difficult sleeping, feelings of hopelessness, reduced ability to feel sympathy and empathy towards clients or family and friends, cynicism at work, resentment of demands being put on you at home or at work, dread with certain clients potentially. I have a fuller list of those in the materials that I included for you to download today, since we are a little just trying to cover a lot in a short amount of time. So you can take a look there if you want a more exhaustive look at these. So I want to talk about triggers. Trigger isn't just a buzzword, even though it is kind of everywhere these days. It's a reminder of a traumatic event that can actually go so far as to reactivate the amygdala's trauma response for years afterwards. So the classic example of a trigger, is the war veteran who, when they hear a car backfiring, like ducks and covers and goes into like fight or flight mode. But social consciousness is slowly expanding to realize that veterans aren't the only ones who experience PTSD, although that is kind of an easy example to point to. Having to face an abuser in a courtroom could be a pretty substantial trigger. So you as a representative of a client need to know what's happening in a client's brain if they're facing a trigger, and think about how you can kind of mitigate that or make space for it. So potential triggers in the lawyer-client relationship in particular. Triggers for clients include loss of control, lack of transparency, and just being overwhelmed by the process, and not feeling heard or believed. Triggers for attorneys include client mistrust, client suspicion, client accusations, client anger, and client failure to meet obligations. So some factors that influence recovery from trauma include personality. Some people just display more resilient personality types than others. Support system, other existing life problems. So again, that financial one sticks out to me as something that might be particularly present within the legal system, just because it can be so expensive also to have representation. And if you are a client dealing with trauma and you're also stressed about money, that can really exacerbate things. Prior trauma. And then one that really stands out to me as important and something that can be mitigated by a lawyer include experiences of victim blaming, shaming, doubt, or denial from systems the victim may turn to for help. So if a victim feels shamed or blamed by their attorney for what happened to them, that can really compound the trauma. And so there are concrete steps that you can take to not only mitigate the client's trauma, but in doing so, mitigate any secondary trauma that you might absorb. Because what I'm pointing out by trying to convey all the science basically is that what is bad for the client is bad for you in terms of trauma. And so if we can improve things for the client, it will also improve things for you and your mental health, hopefully. So I want to talk a little bit more specifically about trauma within the legal profession. So first, here are some professional risk factors that just job characteristics that increase the risk for secondary trauma. Repetitive interpersonal contact with traumatized clients, giving roles that may lead to lack of boundaries with clients and colleagues, long hours and often grueling work in a competitive environment, profession encourages controlling behavior, and lack of training in active listening and psychology. So I'm willing to bet that some of you are going, oh, those circumstances sound familiar as a lawyer. These are a lot of these attributes are kind of baked into the legal profession. They're just kind of inherent to the attorney-client dynamic. And so the risk is very high within the legal profession. Some specific legal triggers, and things that may trigger your client. Meeting with you and your staff about their case, which of course is inevitable, that just has to happen. A lot of these things just have to happen throughout legal proceedings. Direct questioning about events, seeing the perpetrator or objects that serve as reminders of the trauma, the absence of privacy in litigation, feeling kept in the dark, expressions of anger or aggression, and humor. Humor is probably avoidable. You don't need to inject humor where it doesn't need to be, but some people think some people use that as a default to try to lighten things up, or like you might think that you're like comforting someone, but by injecting humor, but it could actually trigger them. Triggers can make the survivor feel like they are reliving their trauma. So in this list, how many of these are inevitable throughout the course of representation, especially if your representation explicitly involves the victim's trauma, which is not always the case. There are like estate planning attorneys who probably, you wouldn't think of that field or that practice area as something that might have a high exposure or high risk for secondary trauma, but you might be dealing with clients who are like in the thick of grief a lot, and you might start to internalize some of that. So we're not just talking about like, like defense attorneys or personal injury attorneys or anything like that. It can be a really broad set of practice areas. So a few other complicating factors. Victims or their families might blame them for the harm that they experience. Poor memory or an inconsistent account of events can complicate things, which again, if we think about that trauma head traffic jam that we talked about, it's no wonder that there can be like conflicting or inconsistent accounts of events. It's just kind of inevitable, and it shouldn't, in an ideal world, it would not be viewed as like something that hampers someone's credibility, but we don't live in an ideal world. The legal system is not victim friendly, so like trial testimony, depositions, long delays, these are not things that are conducive to reducing trauma, and it's just kind of inevitable. The victim may have to share space with the perpetrator in court or elsewhere. The victim may not be ready to move on from the situation or may change their mind. Victim health status and medication use. Victim may avoid therapy, even though it would help the case. So now let's talk a little bit about what you can do about all of this. So trauma-informed care for yourself and your clients. This is a graphic that I found from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. They list the 4 R's of trauma-informed care. And these include realize, recognize, respond, and resist re-traumatization. So realizing involves the widespread, like just recognizing the, well, that's a different one, realizing the widespread impact of trauma and understanding potential paths for recovery, recognizing the symptoms and signs of trauma in clients, families, staff, and others involved in the system. I think that just those two go a long way, that once you, like speaking from experience, again, having been in the ER with people and everything, as soon as you know what's going on, as soon as you understand the science of everything, it's a lot easier to, when you recognize that you're taking on someone else's trauma, just recognizing that decreases it a little bit. So I hope that just by giving names to some of these things, there's power in that. Respond by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices, and that's what we're going to talk about now. And then resist re-traumatization of children, as well as the adults who care for them. So some strategies that you can use with your clients. So these are just some tactics for overcoming common challenges to prevent or lessen the impact of triggers. So present a non-judgmental attitude. I think really embodying the idea of non-judgment is important. Regardless of what someone was doing, what their profession is, what their income level is, they did not deserve what happened to them. Something that we noticed, so I also do interviews to help screen for people who are applying to be emergency room advocates with the organization that I work with. And something that we notice a lot is that if someone is a parent, they are far more like we have these scenarios that we give people that are just kind of made up scenarios about sexual assault and situations where somebody is assaulted. And then we ask like how you interpret this and everything. And if someone is a parent, they are far more likely to inject responsibility on the victim. And so there's a greater sense of like, well, they shouldn't have been wearing that. And I think it is because they, we like to believe that we can protect the people that we care about from harm. And we like to think that if you can do XYZ, you can avoid things. And there's a strong like protective instinct there. And so maybe you have to think about what triggers that with you, what makes you feel judgmental towards people, and how you can actively try to either, you might not be able to get rid of it entirely. You might just always have that impulse, but how you can disguise it a little bit, how you can avoid communicating it to people, basically, judgment when internalized is different from judgment expressed. So maybe we can just think about cutting out that expression. So create an environment for questioning that is private and calming. So don't interview in a hallway or an open area where others are available to hear. Have Kleenex and something available to drink. Be aware of your body language. Your body language can portray if you're listening, active listening is something that you can practice. Your facial expression also speaks volumes. So I know that I have been told that I am somebody, if I am really concentrating on something, I look mean. I have like a very, it's not like an aggressive face or anything, but if I'm like really concentrating, I look kind of stern. And so be aware, ask for feedback from maybe your staff or like other people that you trust about what your face conveys when you might not be aware of it. Be supportive, acknowledge the trauma that has occurred and the difficulty of each stage of the process. Be mindful of your communication style and terminology and how it might be received. How you ask questions can reinforce the idea that the victim is at fault or to blame for what happened. Keep in mind that they are probably already experiencing self-blame, self-doubt, shame, or embarrassment, and mirror their terminology. So if they don't, something that comes up for us a lot is the victim versus survivor, how people self-identify. And we mirror what the person uses. So a lot of people don't like to identify as a victim. It feels like some power is taken from them. On the other hand, a lot of people feel like, no, I this thing happened to me that I did not like ask for. I am a victim. So it's different for everybody. Just mirror what people do or say. Avoid interrupting. Ask things like, then what happened? Tell me more about XYZ. What were you thinking at that point? Or what did they do after that? Instead of leading questions like, did they force you? Were they bigger than you? Did you resist? All right, I think I touched on all of these. Accept and don't take personally your client's wide range of emotions. That's a big one. And again, I think that has to do with that recognized step of just kind of not internalizing what's going on. Okay, somebody said, can you give some examples of non-judgmental language to use? So I think maybe that leading question idea. So, instead of saying, I said what not to say. So like, instead of saying, did they force you? Maybe say, what did they do? Were they bigger than you? Say, how tall were they? Instead of, did you resist? What did you do or say? So do you see how there's some kind of like judgment baked into those initial statements? Especially like, did you resist? If somebody didn't resist, they probably don't feel good about that, but they were dealing with the trauma symptoms that we were talking about previously. So yeah, just kind of not specific like terms or anything, but thinking about how we're phrasing certain things. I hope that helps. All right. Oh, another big one, be aware of your body language and body proximity. That's a big thing. Don't touch people without their consent, especially if you're dealing with somebody who their like bodily autonomy has been challenged by way of the trauma that they've experienced. You might think that you're like comforting someone by putting a hand on their shoulder or something, but you want to ask them if that helps them first. Don't just assume that you can do that. And lastly, be honest and explain why you are being honest or frank. Be real with people. Don't give them unrealistic expectations, but explain to people why you're being honest, that you're not trying to be cold or whatever. You're just trying to give them the best sense of things. All right, some more strategies. Protect the client. So do what you can to protect the client from being in the same room with the perpetrator, from seeing documents with triggering allegations or psychological information about the client. That can be kind of not fun for a client to see their own like psychological profile or something like that. Clients who have been traumatized are often distrustful from having been lied to and taken advantage of. Sexual abuse victims in particular are often angry and suspicious. The more you can have a system in place that lets them know what to expect and keeps them informed about their case, the more safe they will feel and the more they will trust you. So have documents that explain what clients can expect from the matter and what will be expected of them. That's huge. And documents that they can take home with them, that they don't necessarily have to like digest when they're in your office. Give realistic timeframes. An infographic is ideal, explaining the stages of a case. Again, you have to assume, I'm sure that most people do this already, but people who are not lawyers don't know anything about how the legal system works by and large. And so you really have to break it down for people. And something that might be helpful is that when you're designing these documents or these infographics or whatever you're using, show them to people who are not with any like confidential information, of course, but like show them to people who aren't lawyers and who aren't within the legal system and see if it makes sense. Have staff trained in how to work with victims. Ooh, missed one there. There we go. Sorry. And again, just have a system in place to keep a client up to date with happenings, and share the level of documents that they wish to receive. So if they don't want to see everything, don't make them. Oh, okay. So somebody's pointed out that not all of us have clients, yet still are exposed to trauma working in the courts. So I think in this situation, you might have a little less agency over what you can control and what you can't control. So I think maybe for someone in that situation, those first two R's are going to be the biggest, the realize and recognize. And so like the awareness of what's going on and being able to know the like science of everything behind it. Maybe hopefully that will help. All right, before I dive into questions, I am going to wrap this up because I just have 2 more slides. And then so if you send anything from between here and the end, I'll handle it at the end. I wanted to propose this idea of safety planning. Safety planning is a tool that is typically used, in my experience at least, with social workers who are working with domestic abuse clients. And so typically the idea is you're developing a safety plan to ideally get the survivor to leave the abuser or leave the home where the abuse is taking place. And this is the most dangerous moment in the life of an abused person when they are trying to actually leave the relationship. And so what you do is you like map out this list to make a concrete plan for safety and how you can reduce harm as best as possible. And so if you look at this, it talks about the identification that you want to be sure that you have before you leave, important personal papers, funds, keys, a way to communicate, medications, a way to get by, things to help you cope, etc. So you're just kind of planning out all of these things. And so I think that safety planning can be a model to help for people, I think in like myriad situations really, but for people who know that they're going to be encountering traumatized people in their work. So whether you're an attorney or you just work in the court and are exposed to people and everything, what you can do is really map out what is particularly triggering for you, how you typically respond to it, and what you can do to like dampen the effects of that trigger. So what can you do to kind of take care of yourself as you're exposed to these things that really bother you, they get under your skin. And so by kind of this is going to be different for everybody, but by actually mapping that out, I think you can like check things off of a list and like take concrete steps to help yourself. So lastly, I want to talk about some strong routines and care practices. So there's no like magic cure for secondary trauma. The first time I taught this program, in the feedback from an attorney, I got like, well, you didn't tell me how to fix my mental health. And I was like, well, that's not really a thing. The best that we can do is kind of have awareness and think about tactics to decrease the effect of things. There's no magic cure, but eat, sleep, exercise, and socializing are 4 really big things that sound obvious and simple, but they, eating well, or just making sure that you're eating, period. A lot of people, their default when they're in moments of high stress is to just skip meals or not eat. And that really doesn't help anything, because what I hope that I have conveyed in this program is that so much of trauma is physical. It's such a bodily experience. And so you have to take care of your body. You have to exercise, you have to sleep, you have to do all these things that your body needs to function. Limit exposure to difficult people. If you know that you have a client who just really gets under your skin, do what you can to limit that exposure. Forgive your mistakes. Everybody is going to make mistakes, and everybody is going to say the wrong thing or do something that maybe isn't good for your client. You're going to say something that is accidentally really triggering to the client, and you just have to forgive yourself for that. It's bound to happen. Get help when needed. I'm in Illinois. I don't know what the services available for lawyers in Massachusetts are like, but here we have the Lawyers Assistance Program, which offers, I believe, free counseling and free and confidential counseling to attorneys in Illinois. So take advantage of those programs that exist. And then play. Remember to have some fun. Find something that brings you a lot of joy, whether it's a hobby or just maybe it is watching Law and Order SVU. Have some awareness about that. But if at the end of the day that is what really hits that spot for you, go for it. All right, so that is the end of what I wanted to cover. I'm going to open things up for Q&A. I know there was one that I didn't get to yet. So somebody asked for suggestions for giving realistic timelines when the timelines are entirely out of your hands and vary widely depending on who is president. I think that's fair to convey. You can like map out the ideal timeline and then say, here are the variables at play. Here are the things that I can't control. Here's the like best case scenario, worst case scenario. I think the transparency there is key. Do you have any tips for dealing with triggering opposing parties or counsel? So I think that's a good thing that I will make note of for maybe future installments of this program to include. Off the top of my head, I think maybe, so like some crisis intervention skills are coming to mind where it has more to do with like diffusing situations. In my training as an emergency room advocate, something that we are trained to deal with are like nurses who might be, there are amazing nurses out there, and there are a lot of nurses who are trained to deal with sexual assault victims, but a lot of them are not. And the ones who are not have a history of, saying really problematic things to patients, or just like the regulations are really hard to keep track of. And so they don't always know what the most recent regulations are and everything. Or law enforcement who say things to survivors that you think are really harmful and that you don't really have control over. So that strikes me as maybe a similar situation where your ability to control the situation and your ability to react are both dampened. And so I think strategies to deal with that, maybe like, first of all, preparing your client. If you have an opposing counsel that you think is just really going to like go after the client's credibility or try to do things that will really trigger the client, being honest about that. In terms of protecting yourself, preparing for that frustration, preparing for these things, kind of that safety planning idea, maybe that would be beneficial here. And then somebody said, is there a way that we can reduce how much we're triggered by routine, but still devastating systemic failures for which there is no path for redress? That's a really good question. And that is something that I think a lot of people struggle with, that there just aren't, the system is not built to protect certain people. And it's really heartbreaking. And there's not a lot that you can do about it in terms of mitigating some of that devastation. I think personally, what helps me in situations like that is focusing on the concrete moments where you have had an impact on someone's life, despite the system, despite the things that you can't help. I don't mean to make this all about me, but it's just my experience. It's part of the reason why I became an emergency room advocate, was because I felt like sexual violence was such a prevalent part of our culture, and that the tools for justice in these situations were so flawed. And so becoming an advocate helped me, it made me feel like I can't control the system, but I can control this moment with this person, and I can make sure that they are not going to be victim blamed in the emergency room, or something like that. So it's kind of a matter of refocusing your attention on the things that you can control and the things that you can improve or mitigate for people. I know that's maybe not a super satisfying answer, but I hope that it helps. I'm not seeing any other questions, but I will stay here for a second and see if anything comes through.
And this has been amazing. I see that we're getting some more questions come in. I just want to chime in with the few of the questions were to date. So first of all, you have done a wonderful presentation and great responses to these questions. Thank you for engagement. Thank you for everyone who's written in with questions. For a few other parts, as Anne says, unfortunately, there's no magic wand for Massachusetts. We can, though, part of Lawyers Concern for Lawyers is trying to help manage lawyers' well-being, help you learn to care for yourselves, manage your emotions, manage your practices better in different ways. So there are a couple of resources I wanted to let people be aware of. First of all, our next webinar for busy lawyers in August, and I will talk more about that at the end, will actually be on the topic of managing difficult emotions in the workplace. That will be given by one of my colleagues who is a clinician here. So LCL is a lawyer assistance program, similar to what Anne said is in Illinois. We do both clinical help and also non-clinical with the practice management assistant side. So all of it is free and confidential. If you want to set up consultations with that, we encourage you to do so. I also wanted to note we have some other services that people may find helpful. For example, one of our clinicians does several mindfulness and self-compassion series throughout the years. We've also had past webinars with strategies about setting boundaries, benefits for sleeping better, preventing and responding to burnout, things along these lines. I think that today's presentation was so helpful so that we can really start to give language to these and to go through, for example, the 4 R's, the trauma-informed care, as Anne laid out, the realize, recognize, respond, and resist re-traumatization. But I just wanted to let you know that certainly do contact LCL and MASLOMAP for further questions and resources on this. All right, so let's see what we have for some other questions. Well, we have a lot of engagement here.
Yeah, so a question came through while you were talking, Laura, that I'm really interested in. So this person said they're a defense attorney who works with the accused and not the victim, which is really not something that I have focused on very much at all. But I think is really interesting. And again, this kind of motivates me to think about this in the future. But you know, so this person was asking, you know, we don't get to choose our clients. What can you do when you deal with the accused versus the victim? The first thing that jumps out to me is this idea that hurt people. And so you don't get to choose your client, but keep in mind that this person who maybe did, innocent until proven guilty and all that, but they might have done this horrible thing to somebody. And it would be really easy to look at this person as a monster or having done this monstrous thing, but that person didn't exist in a vacuum up until that moment. You know, they probably, odds are, went through their own history of trauma and everything. And so maybe broadening your view of the person, or like trying to, again, just like refocus on those ideas about what this person went through to give you like more of an empathetic view of the person. This might be like super obvious to you and you're doing it already, but that just immediately comes to mind for me. But and then, you know, using in terms of the secondary trauma of it all, for you, I think a lot of the stuff that we talked about still stands, you know, creating, having the awareness of what's going on, having an awareness of why this person is acting the way that they are, and then trying to separate that like internalization path between you and the client. I hope that helps. Again, thank you for giving me something to chew on for the future. I think that's really interesting. And then somebody added, yeah, most defendants have a trauma history, which I think is true. So I hope that is not super basic.
That is all excellent information, and thank you for your candor and your empathy as you're responding to these questions too. It's hard. There are no easy answers.
Yeah.
I just wanted to note, someone also wrote in the comments to us to share with everyone as well, that they had an idea of maybe keeping a list of wins and victories would be helpful for going forward. To have, I think, some optimism is a great suggestion. I'll let you continue while next person says, thank you, and we do a lot of work with the client's mental health as underlying the alleged crime. Yes, there's a lot of complex components with when you're dealing with clients, you know, whether they are appointed you, whether you can choose them. There are a lot of struggles for both the clients and for the lawyers. And I'll turn back to you here.
Okay, so somebody said, part of what is hard is that folks in private practice do have to charge for their work. Taking a trauma-informed approach to your practice takes a lot of time, and it is very difficult to charge appropriately for your time. This can really force lawyers to have to work nights and weekends to make a living and make it hard to have time for self-care. Any suggestions? So I think what I want to say there is that having a trauma-informed approach to your practice, I think maybe you can think about ways that you can operationalize some of these things. So like the forms that we talked about before, the infographics, things like that. Think about how you can, everyone always talks about automation, and maybe this isn't the best situation for that, but like to the best of your ability, how you can create forms that will like be reusable. And, you know, not a lot of a trauma-informed practice is like, you're right, time, where you have to spend time with a client, or you have to build in, you do things a little bit more slowly. And so that's just kind of an inevitable element that we're talking about here, where it's going to take more time. But there are other elements of a trauma-informed approach that you can, again, just like operationalize a little bit. And so maybe thinking about it that way, if that helps at all. You know, unfortunately, there are limitations there, but I think that's something to think about. All right, somebody said, I find the court personnel has become increasingly aggressive and difficult to work with, and there's no way to avoid them. If you are not a favored attorney by a clerk, it feels like an abusive situation day in and day out. Any suggestions? Oh, I'm really sorry. That's really unfortunate. Let's see. I don't have any like immediate suggestions about how to deal with that, because I don't have a super concrete sense of what that would look like, I guess, that sort of dynamic. But I guess depersonalizing things as best as you can. Yeah, I don't know. That's really unfortunate. I'm sorry. That's a tricky one. Let me kind of think about that as I go on. And if I get any ideas, I will tell you. Somebody said, my clients generally have a second grade education and only speak Spanish or Haitian Creole. So it has become really hard to make operationalized systems. Oh, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, that's interesting. That's an interesting barrier to think about. Yeah, again, I'm sorry, I don't have any like immediate suggestions, but yeah, sorry.
And I have two ideas for those. For operationalizing when your clients have limited literacy, maybe you could think about when Anne was talking before with the infographics of having pictures of a timeline of, you know, here's different phases of what your court case is apt to go through. So, you know, first we're going to have a square and it will be this hearing, and then we're going to have an arrow and talk about file some paperwork, and then maybe you have you know, a diamond to say like, we're going to then, file this with court. I think maybe if you help it with pictures, it might give them an idea of what to come. As far as with a clerk, that is hard. I would just let you know that the clerk personnel are usually so overwhelmed and so backlogged to just have empathy for them as well. And maybe if you are extra kind to them, it will really come back to you as well, and that they may be having a stressful day, and to not take it personally.
Great, thank you. That's a great idea. Okay, there's a lot coming in here. This is the most responsive audience I've worked with in a long time. It's really nice. So somebody left a comment for the person who was talking about public defenders who work with the accused. So they shared a resource there that you should check out, and they included contact information. But basically they said getting a therapist who specializes in PTSD or trauma is a great place to start. Somebody said, any recommendations for implementing trauma-informed practices or approaches remotely? That's a great question. So something that immediately stands out to me is the idea of like contacting your clients in the way that they want to be contacted. So, if you're working with somebody who has tenuous housing, maybe like FaceTime isn't the way to go. Maybe that feels burdensome or invasive to them, and they would prefer a phone call, or even texting works different in different jurisdictions, I know, but texting where possible, things along those lines maybe would be beneficial. And then the other thing that jumps out to me is just really making sure that you and your staff are on the same page. And so I think it's important that the trauma-informed practice can't just be you, it has to be your staff too, if they are in any way like interfacing with clients. All right, somebody said, I'm a solo practitioner working in child abuse. We put up with a lot of abusive behavior, and knowing when to withdraw is real. I believe it is similar in criminal law. It takes its toll. Court personnel has become increasingly antagonistic in many courts, unyielding when we are doing everything we can do to do our best. I think though that we also need to remind clients that though we can listen, we aren't therapists. I can be trauma responsive, but that doesn't make me a therapist. That's a great point. And then someone said, I often feel like it's difficult to make sure that clients feel heard or supported when discussing difficult or traumatic topics when we are only available to talk over the phone. Yeah, that's real. During the pandemic, our like emergency room services were suspended for a long time, and we were dealing with clients over the phone, which is not ideal at all. Like I remember in one particularly egregious example, I was working with a survivor who was in the emergency room whose jaw had been broken. And so it's just like the last thing this person wants to do is sit and talk on the phone, I imagine, and so it's just, it makes the job a lot harder. That's real. And unfortunately, I have not figured out what to do about that when there are just certain limitations. All right, that's all that I'm seeing for right now.
I'll add in a couple ideas for that. I know that they say over the phone, if you want to convey warmth to someone, to smile, and even if they can't see it, sometimes they can hear it in your voice.
Yeah.
Perhaps you might try that when listening. The other thing is, if you're with someone who is hesitant to tell their story, maybe give a couple more seconds when you're on the phone to let them respond, or keep doing those encouraging phrases that Anne gave us some examples of non-judgmental, such as, and then tell me what happened, and then what happened next, maybe to help it out. But it is difficult if it's over the phone.
Yeah.
So I see that we are getting close to our time here. I want to respect everyone's time. There also have been some questions about the materials. So we are going to, later today or tomorrow, we will send out the slides, the recording, and the materials that Anne has so generously put together for us. So all of that will be emailed to you from your registration information. As I noted, our next webinar for busy lawyers, I think a lot of you would be interested in, will be Wednesday, August 17th. That topic will be managing difficult emotions in the workplace. And I just want to say to Anne, we are so grateful to have you. I know that this is a really big topic. You did a marvelous job in really tackling this for us. Before I turn it over to you for closing thoughts, I want to thank all of you again for being here, for reaching out, and just to remind you that if you have further questions or you want to talk one-on-one, we do have clinicians on site who are trained social workers, trained psychologists, as well as my side of the house, which does practice management. So certainly encourage you all to reach out anytime for free confidential consultation. Anne, would you like to have closing thoughts on this topic?
Thank you so much, Laura. I just really appreciate having this platform to talk to you all about this. It's an issue that I think is really important, and you all have given me a lot to think about, so I appreciate that as well. And yeah, I think these issues can feel really overwhelming when they're acute or when you're dealing with them constantly and for like a prolonged period of time. And I think one of the things that people tend to get when I get out of it, when I have taught this program elsewhere, is that they just see that other people are dealing with these things. And so I hope that if nothing else, you have gained some sense of community and commiseration here, because you're not alone. And I hope that you have a little bit more sense of the like framework and everything. And now you have the resources that I included in the materials and everything. And I hope that you will take advantage of them and take this to the next steps and everything. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Anne. That was wonderful. And thank you for being our guest expert, and attendees. Thank you so much for being here with us on this critical topic. We appreciate your time, and I wish everyone a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Have a good one.